The soft glow of dawn was just beginning to illuminate the eastern sky over Yellowstone National Park when David Mercer, a 42-year-old wildlife photographer from Portland, emerged from his tent. The air was crisp with the lingering chill of night, carrying the fresh scent of pine and the distant sulfurous hint of the park's famous geothermal features. David had been planning this trip for months, meticulously timing his visit to coincide with the early summer season, when the park's wildlife would be most active and the summer crowds would still be relatively thin. As he quietly set up his portable camp stove to brew his morning coffee, David savored the tranquility of the moment. His campsite, located in one of the park's more remote areas near the edge of a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, offered the solitude he craved for his photography work. He had specifically requested this location, Site 37 at the Avalanche Creek Campground, knowing it would provide the perfect base for his planned 3-week expedition to document the park's diverse ecosystem. David was no novice to wildlife photography. With 15 years of experience and publications in National Geographic, BBC Wildlife, and several other prestigious nature magazines, he had developed a reputation for capturing intimate moments of animal life rarely seen by the casual observer. His specialty was predator-prey relationships, and he had come to Yellowstone hoping to add to his portfolio of wolf, bear, and elk interactions that had become his trademark. The previous day had been productive. He'd managed to photograph a female grizzly with 2 cubs foraging in a distant meadow, and later captured some striking images of a bull elk silhouetted against the setting sun. Today, he planned to venture deeper into the backcountry, hoping to reach a spot where park rangers had reported recent wolf activity. As his coffee began to brew, David reached for his equipment bag and started his morning ritual of checking and cleaning his cameras. His primary setup was a high-end Canon with a telephoto lens that had cost him nearly as much as his car, but it was worth every penny for the crisp, detailed images it produced. Beside it lay his secondary camera, equipped with a wide-angle lens for landscape shots, and a small but powerful Sony video camera for capturing animal behavior in real time. The coffee was just about ready when David heard it, a sound that seemed oddly out of place in the morning chorus of bird calls and rustling leaves. It was a deep, resonant whooping noise, followed by what sounded like rhythmic knocking, as if someone were striking wood against wood. David froze, coffee pot in hand, straining his ears to locate the source of the unusual sounds. The whooping came again, louder this time, emanating from the dense forest beyond the clearing. David's first thought was that it might be other campers, perhaps a family with children playing some kind of game, but he quickly dismissed the idea. The campground was sparsely populated this early in the season, and the nearest occupied site was at least a quarter-mile away. Besides, these sounds had a wild, primal quality that seemed distinctly non-human. His curiosity piqued, David set down his coffee and reached for his video camera. Whatever was making those sounds, he wanted to document it. As he did so, he noticed something else. The forest had gone eerily quiet. The constant background chatter of birds and small animals that he'd grown accustomed to had ceased abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. In his years of wildlife observation, David had learned to recognize this sudden silence as a warning sign. It usually meant a predator was moving through the area, a wolf perhaps, or a bear. But the whooping sounds didn't match either of those predators. Wolves howled, and bears might grunt or roar. But this was something altogether different. With his video camera in hand, David moved cautiously toward the edge of his campsite, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The sun was higher now, its golden light filtering through the canopy and creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. For several minutes he stood motionless, watching and waiting. Then, just as he was beginning to think the sounds had moved, he saw it, a flicker of movement among the trees, about 50 yards into the forest. David raised his camera and peered through the viewfinder, adjusting the zoom to get a better look. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There, partially obscured by a stand of lodgepole pines, was a large, dark figure moving with surprising grace for its size. At first, David thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, a common enough sight in Yellowstone, but as he watched, he realized this was something else entirely. The creature was bipedal, walking upright on two legs with a smooth, rolling gait that seemed too fluid, too purposeful to be a bear's awkward vertical stance. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with a powerful build that suggested tremendous strength. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair, not the shaggy fur of a bear, but something that lay flatter against the body, more like a primate's coat. David's fingers trembled slightly as he pressed the record button on his camera. He could scarcely believe what he was seeing, but his training as a photographer took over. Whatever this creature was, he needed to document it. He steadied his breathing, focusing on keeping the camera as still as possible as he zoomed in further. Now, he could make out more details. The creature's arms were disproportionately long, hanging almost to its knees. Its shoulders were broad and sloped, lending it a somewhat hunched appearance. The head sat directly on those massive shoulders with no discernible neck, and from what David could see, it had a pronounced sagittal crest, a ridge of bone running along the top of the skull that was consistent with powerful jaw muscles. David watched, heart pounding in his chest. The creature paused near a fallen log and seemed to be examining something on the ground. To his astonishment, it reached down with startling dexterity and appeared to be gathering something, berries perhaps, or mushrooms. The movements were deliberate, almost human-like in their precision. Then something extraordinary happened. Behind a nearby thicket, a smaller figure emerged. This one was similar in appearance to the first, but stood only about 6 feet tall and had a more slender build. Its hair seemed to be a lighter shade, a reddish-brown rather than the dark, almost black coloration of the larger creature. A female, David surmised, if these were indeed the same species. But the real shock came a moment later when 2 even smaller figures appeared, trailing behind the female. Cubs? No, not cubs. Juveniles. They stood upright just like the adults, but were considerably smaller, perhaps 4 to 5 feet tall. One appeared more adventurous than the other, moving slightly ahead and occasionally picking up objects from the forest floor, while the second stayed close to the female, seemingly more cautious. A family. David was looking at a family group of what could only be Sasquatch, Bigfoot, a creature whose existence had been debated, dismissed, and defended for decades, but never conclusively proven. And here they were, just 50 yards from his campsite, going about their morning routine as if it were the most natural thing in the world. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 10 minutes, David remained frozen in place, his camera capturing every movement as the family group foraged among the trees. They moved with a kind of muted coordination, occasionally communicating with each other through soft grunts and that same whooping sound he had heard earlier. The larger creature, the male, he presumed, seemed to be leading the group, often, stopping to scan the surroundings with a watchfulness that spoke of intelligence and awareness. David was so engrossed in what he was witnessing that he failed to notice a small branch by his foot. As he shifted his weight to get a better angle, the dry wood snapped with a crack that seemed deafening in the quiet forest. Instantly, all 4 creatures turned toward the sound, their reactions speaking of acute hearing and heightened alertness. The male's reaction was particularly striking. It straightened to its full height, which David now estimated to be closer to 8 feet, and stared directly at his position. Even at that distance, David could feel the intensity of its gaze. The female immediately moved toward the juveniles, placing herself between them and the perceived threat. For a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, man and creature regarded each other across the divide of the clearing. David continued filming, his camera capturing the remarkable scene unfolding before him. The male Sasquatch made no aggressive moves but stood its ground, its posture communicating a clear message. It was aware of David's presence and was assessing the potential danger. Then, with a series of soft grunts that seemed to be directed at the female and juveniles, the male began to back away slowly, never taking its eyes off David's position. The family group followed the male's lead, moving deeper into the forest with a coordinated efficiency that spoke of long practice. Within moments, they had disappeared into the dense undergrowth, leaving nothing but swaying branches and disturbed foliage to mark their passage. David lowered his camera, his hands shaking now not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization of what he had just witnessed. He had captured on video what countless expeditions, researchers, and enthusiasts had been seeking for over a century: clear, detailed footage of a family group of Sasquatch in their natural habitat. His mind raced with questions and implications. Should he report this immediately? Who should he tell? Would anyone believe him? The scientific community had long relegated Bigfoot to the realm of folklore and hoaxes, despite the numerous sightings reported over the years. But this was different. He had high-definition video footage, captured by a professional wildlife photographer with a reputation for integrity. This couldn't be so easily dismissed. As David made his way back to his camp, his coffee now cold and forgotten, he carefully rewound the footage on his camera and played it back. The images were clear, shockingly so. The creatures' movements, their interactions, the details of their physical appearance, all were captured with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity. This wasn't a man in a suit, a misidentified bear, or a play of shadows in the forest. This was something else entirely. David knew that what he had captured would change everything, not just for him personally, but potentially for our understanding of North American wildlife, primate evolution, and the countless stories of Sasquatch encounters that had been reported throughout history but never taken seriously by mainstream science. With hands that still trembled slightly, David packed his most valuable equipment, including the camera with the precious footage, into his backpack. He needed to get back to civilization, to secure the footage and figure out his next steps. But as he prepared to break camp, a new thought struck him. What if he could capture more? What if this family group was resident in the area, and he could document their behavior over time? The temptation was powerful. As a wildlife photographer, he understood the value of behavioral documentation. Not just a glimpse, but the patterns and routines that revealed the true nature of a species. But he also recognized the responsibility that came with his discovery. If these creatures were real, and his footage suggested they undeniably were, then they had managed to remain hidden for a reason. Exposing their presence to the world could have profound implications for their safety and continued existence. It was this internal debate that delayed David's departure from the campsite. Instead of breaking camp immediately, he decided to remain for at least another day, hoping for a second encounter that might provide more context for what he had seen. He secured his equipment, double-checking that the precious video was safely stored, and then set about rearranging his camp to better observe the forest edge where the creatures had appeared. As the day progressed, David alternated between reviewing his footage, making detailed notes of what he had observed, and scanning the forest for any sign of the Sasquatch family's return. The regular sounds of the forest had returned. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the distant bugle of an elk. But there was no further sign of the extraordinary creatures he had witnessed that morning. It was nearing dusk when David heard the crunch of footsteps approaching his campsite. His heart leaped, wondering if the Sasquatch had returned, but it was a human figure that emerged from the trail, a National Park Service ranger in the distinctive gray and green uniform. Evening. The ranger called as she approached. Just making the rounds, checking on campers. Everything all right here? The ranger, whose name badge identified her as Sarah Blackwood, was in her mid-30s with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors and keen eyes that seemed to miss nothing as they scanned David's campsite. For a moment, David hesitated. Should he tell her what he had seen? Would a park ranger be a skeptic or an ally? The decision was momentous. Once he shared his discovery, there would be no going back. The footage would become public knowledge, and whatever consequences followed, good or bad, would be set in motion. Actually, David said finally, his voice steadier than he expected, I saw something this morning that I think you should know about. Ranger Blackwood raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting from routine friendliness to professional interest. Oh? What kind of something? Bear? Wolf? David shook his head, then gestured to the camp chair beside his own. You might want to sit down for this, and I have something to show you. As the ranger took a seat, David retrieved his camera and brought up the footage from that morning. He handed it to her without comment, letting the images speak for themselves. The transformation in Ranger Blackwood's expression as she watched was remarkable. From polite interest to shock, disbelief, and then a kind of dawning wonder that mirrored David's own reaction hours earlier. This is, she began, then stopped, her eyes still fixed on the screen. This was taken here? Today? David nodded. This morning, just after dawn, they were right there. He pointed to the section of forest where he had observed the family. 2 adults and 2 juveniles. They were foraging? Seemed to be looking for food, and then they spotted me and moved off. The ranger looked up from the camera, studying David's face as if trying to detect any sign of deception. Finding none, she returned her attention to the footage, replaying certain sections, occasionally pausing to examine specific details. I've been a ranger in Yellowstone for 11 years, she said finally, her voice careful, measured. In that time, I've heard stories, things other rangers have seen, reports from backcountry hikers that never made it into official documents. But this, she gestured to the camera. This is different. This is evidence. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Evidence. Not a story, not a claimed sighting, but tangible, visual proof of something that science had long relegated to the realm of myth and misidentification. What happens now? David asked, suddenly acutely aware that his discovery was no longer his alone. I'm a wildlife photographer. I document nature. I don't expose it. But this feels bigger than me. Ranger Blackwood nodded slowly, her brow furrowed in thought. It is bigger than any one of us. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't proceed with caution. She handed the camera back to David, her expression grave. Let me make some calls. There are protocols for unusual wildlife sightings, though I'll admit nothing specifically for this. But there are people within the Park Service who need to see this before it goes any further. David felt a surge of relief. The burden of the discovery had been weighing on him heavily, and the prospect of sharing it with people who could help navigate the complex implications was welcome. I think that's wise, he agreed. I'm not looking for fame or to exploit what I saw. I just want to make sure this is handled responsibly, both for the scientific value and for the protection of these creatures, if they are indeed what they appear to be. The ranger stood, her decision apparently made. I'll need to report this immediately. Can you remain here for now? Try not to discuss this with anyone else until we've had a chance to assess the situation properly. David nodded his agreement. I'm not going anywhere. My permit allows me to stay for another 17 days. And frankly, I'm hoping they might return. There's so much we could learn from observing them. Just be careful, Ranger Blackwood cautioned. If what you captured is indeed a family of Sasquatch, we know almost nothing about their behavior, their territoriality, or how they might react to human presence. Keep your distance and don't do anything to provoke them. With that warning, the ranger departed, moving quickly down the trail with a purpose in her stride that hadn't been there before. David watched her go, then turned back to his campsite, the reality of his situation slowly sinking in. He had discovered something extraordinary, something that could potentially rewrite natural history. But with that discovery came a profound responsibility, one that would determine not just his own future, but possibly the future of the creatures he had documented. As night fell over Yellowstone, David sat by his campfire, the dancing flames providing little comfort against the weight of his thoughts. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight, a family of creatures whose existence had been debated for generations was going about their lives, unaware that their secret world was about to be exposed to the scrutiny of human curiosity. David couldn't help but wonder, had he done the right thing in sharing his discovery? Or had he set in motion events that would forever alter the delicate balance that had allowed these remarkable beings to remain hidden for so long? Only time would tell, and as David gazed into the flames, he knew that the coming days would test not just his professional judgment, but his ethical compass as well. In the distance, beyond the soft crackle of his campfire, a deep, resonant whooping sound echoed through the forest, a reminder that whatever decisions humans might make, the Sasquatch family continued their ancient rhythm of life in the wild heart of Yellowstone, as they had perhaps done for centuries before human eyes ever glimpsed their shadowy presence. The night deepened, and David prepared for sleep, securing his precious footage and setting up his equipment for another day of observation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but for now, the knowledge that he had witnessed something few humans ever had was enough. As he drifted off, the whooping calls grew fainter, a wild lullaby from creatures that straddled the border between myth and reality, a border that David's discovery was about to redraw forever. Dawn broke over. Yellowstone, with the soft palette of lavenders and golds that had drawn painters and photographers to the park for generations. David awoke early, his sleep having been fitful and interrupted by both excitement and anxiety. He immediately checked his camera and backup drives, reassuring himself that the extraordinary footage was still there, still clear, still undeniable, in what it revealed. A quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong coffee fueled him as he prepared for what would undoubtedly be a day unlike any other in his career. He had just finished packing his day bag with camera equipment, water, and protein bars when he heard multiple sets of footsteps approaching his campsite. Ranger Blackwood emerged from the trail, but she wasn't alone. Behind her walked 3 individuals, whose presence instantly conveyed the seriousness with which the Park Service was treating David's discovery. The first was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a weathered face and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. The badge on his uniform identified him as Chief Ranger Marcus Reynolds, the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the park. The second figure was a lean, academic-looking woman in her 40s, dressed in field clothes, but with none of the insignia of the National Park Service. The third was a younger man carrying sophisticated-looking audio and video equipment, his expression a mixture of skepticism and barely contained excitement. "Mr. Mercer," Ranger Blackwood began, her tone formal, yet tinged with an undercurrent of urgency. "This is Chief Ranger Reynolds, Dr. Eleanor Chen from the Yellowstone Wildlife Biology Division, and Alex Wilder, our audio-visual documentation specialist." Chief Reynolds stepped forward, extending his hand to David. "Mr. Mercer, I understand you've captured something rather extraordinary on camera. Ranger Blackwood has briefed me, but I'd like to hear your account firsthand." David shook the offered hand, then gestured to the folding chairs around his small camp table. "Please, have a seat. I'd be happy to explain everything I saw, but honestly, the footage speaks for itself." For the next 20 minutes, David recounted his experience in detail, the strange sounds that had first alerted him, the family group's behavior, their apparent social structure, and their reaction when they detected his presence. The 3 newcomers listened intently, occasionally exchanging glances but asking no questions until he had finished. And you're certain what you observed wasn't a bear family? Dr. Chen asked, her tone not dismissive but professionally cautious. Black bears can appear surprisingly bipedal when standing, and in certain light conditions. With all due respect, Dr. Chen, David interrupted gently, I've photographed every species of bear in North America, often at close range. What I saw yesterday wasn't a bear or any other known animal. The locomotion alone was entirely different, fluid, bipedal walking, not the occasional standing posture bears adopt. But rather than debate, let me show you. David retrieved his camera, connected it to a small portable monitor he used for field editing, and played the footage. The reaction was immediate and profound. Alex Wilder, the AV specialist who had maintained a skeptical expression throughout David's narrative, leaned forward with widening eyes. Dr. Chen's professional reserve cracked visibly as she watched, her mouth slightly agape. Chief Reynolds maintained his composure, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests of his chair. My God, Dr. Chen whispered as the footage showed the juvenile Sasquatch reaching up to what appeared to be a berry bush. The hand morphology, the grasping motion. That's primate behavior. Advanced primate behavior. The proportions are all wrong for a human in a costume, Alex added, his skepticism evaporating. The arm length relative to torso, the shoulder width, the distinctive gait. You couldn't fake that with current costume technology, not with that fluidity of movement. Chief Reynolds watched in silence until the footage ended, then fixed David with an intense gaze. Mr. Mercer, I need to ask you directly. Is there any possibility, any at all, that this is an elaborate hoax? Anything you've manipulated or staged? David met the Chief Ranger's eyes squarely. None whatsoever. I'm a wildlife photographer with a reputation built on integrity. I've never faked an image in my life, and I certainly wouldn't start with something this extraordinary. Test the footage. Analyze it however you need to. It's authentic. The Chief Ranger nodded, seemingly satisfied. That's exactly what we intend to do. Alex here is an expert in video authentication, and will be sending copies to external specialists as well. He turned to Dr. Chen. Eleanor, your preliminary assessment? Dr. Chen ran a hand through her short, gray-streaked hair, her expression both troubled and exhilarated. From a biological perspective, what we're seeing is unprecedented. If authentic, and I have no reason to doubt Mr. Mercer, this would represent not just a new species, but an entirely unknown great ape in North America, where no great apes have ever been documented in the fossil record. She paused, collecting her thoughts. The implications for evolutionary biology, for our understanding of primate dispersion and adaptation, are staggering. So what happens now? David asked, looking from one face to another. Chief Reynolds straightened in his chair, assuming the mantle of authority. For now, this remains classified as a sensitive wildlife observation. We have protocols for unusual sightings, though I'll admit they were designed more for mountain lions in unexpected areas, or the occasional wolf-dog hybrid, not— He gestured at the monitor. This. We need to establish a research parameter, Dr. Chen interjected. A secure perimeter around this area. Minimal personnel, absolutely no media involvement until we've had a chance to properly document and study these creatures in their natural state. The Chief Ranger nodded in agreement. Mr. Mercer, I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to temporarily surrender all copies of this footage. You'll receive a receipt, and I assure you your intellectual property rights will be respected. But we need to control the flow of information until we've established the proper procedures. David had anticipated this request and had already made his decision. I understand, but I have conditions. First, I want to remain involved in the documentation process. This is the wildlife discovery of the century, and as the person who first recorded it, I should have a role in how it's studied and presented to the world. Chief Reynolds looked as though he might object, but Dr. Chen nodded emphatically. That's reasonable. Mr. Mercer's expertise as a wildlife photographer would be invaluable, and since these creatures have already been exposed to his presence, without apparent aggression, there's a scientific argument for his continued involvement. Second, David continued, I want assurances about how this information will be used. These creatures, this family, deserves protection. They're clearly intelligent, social beings. I won't be part of anything that leads to them being tracked, tranquilized, captured, or otherwise harmed in the name of science or public curiosity. A brief silence followed this declaration. It was Alex, surprisingly, who broke it. He's right. If word gets out about this before proper protections are in place, it'll be a circus. Every Bigfoot hunter, crypto tourist, and sensation seeker in the country will descend on Yellowstone. These creatures won't stand a chance. Chief Reynolds considered this, then gave a curt nod. Agreed. Wildlife protection is our mandate, and until we determine otherwise, these beings are classified as wildlife under the jurisdiction of Yellowstone National Park and subject to all applicable federal protection laws. He fixed David with a steady gaze. However, I'll need your complete cooperation. No communications about this to outside parties, no social media, no calls to colleagues or media contacts. Are we clear? Crystal clear, David confirmed. My primary concern is documenting them properly while ensuring their safety. Nothing else matters. With the agreement established, the next several hours were a flurry of activity. Alex Wilder set up sophisticated equipment to create secure backup copies of David's footage. Dr. Chen made numerous phone calls to colleagues, speaking in carefully. Coded language about a significant primate observation requiring immediate protocol development. Chief Reynolds coordinated with park security to establish an unobtrusive perimeter around the sighting area, explaining it to other rangers as a sensitive wildlife monitoring situation. By mid-afternoon, a small specialized team had begun to assemble at the ranger station nearest to David's campsite. In addition to those who had visited his camp that morning, the team now included Dr. Michael Blackburn, a primatologist from UC Berkeley who happened to be in the park studying squirrel behavior, Dr. Samira Patel, the Park Service's regional wildlife veterinarian, and Special Agent Lindsay Torres from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who specialized in endangered species protection. David had been escorted to the ranger station to brief the expanded team. The meeting took place in a small conference room normally used for staff training, now hastily converted into a command center for what was being called Operation Forest Watch. The footage is authentic, Alex announced to the assembled experts, having spent hours analyzing every frame. No digital manipulation. No evidence of costumes or props. The movement patterns, particularly the way the subjects navigate the uneven terrain, would be virtually impossible to fake. Dr. Blackburn, the primatologist, couldn't contain his excitement. The morphology suggests a hominid species, but with distinct adaptations to the mountain environment. The sagittal crest, the broad shoulders, the relatively short legs compared to arm length, all consistent with a large, powerful primate adapted for cold weather survival and forest mobility. What about their behavior? Dr. Patel asked, turning to David. You mentioned they were foraging. Could you elaborate on their interactions with each other? David described the apparent social structure, the large male taking a protective, sentinel role, the female focusing on the juveniles, the way they communicated with soft vocalizations and body language. There was clear intelligence in their movements and decisions, he explained. When they detected me, the male didn't panic or charge. He assessed the threat, communicated with the others, and made a strategic withdrawal. That's complex social behavior. Assuming these are the same creatures from folklore, Special Agent Torres mused, it would explain their legendary elusiveness. If they possess that level of intelligence and caution around humans, combined with what appears to be excellent camouflage adaptation to the forest environment, they could feasibly have avoided definitive detection for centuries. Chief Reynolds, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. Fascinating as these speculations are, we need an action plan. Dr. Chen, what's your recommendation for immediate next steps? Dr. Chen had been making extensive notes throughout the discussion. She looked up, her expression serious. We need comprehensive, non-invasive documentation, camera traps with infrared capabilities set up throughout the area, audio recording, equipment to capture their vocalizations, and subtle collection of environmental DNA from hair, footprints, anything they might have touched. All of this must be done with minimal human presence to avoid disturbing their normal behavior patterns. And absolute containment of information, Agent Torres added firmly. If this leaks before we have protection protocols in place, these creatures could be in serious danger, from well-intentioned researchers, thrill seekers, or worse, trophy hunters. The mention of trophy hunters sent a chill through the room. David hadn't even considered that grim possibility, and the thought of the magnificent creatures he had witnessed being killed for bragging rights or pseudo-scientific specimens was unbearable. How long can we reasonably expect to keep this contained? Ranger Blackwood asked, voicing the question that had been on everyone's mind. Yellowstone has millions of visitors annually. Even with this area temporarily restricted, someone else could have a sighting. Chief Reynolds frowned. Based on similar sensitive wildlife situations, I'd estimate we have a week, maybe 2, before rumors start spreading. We need to use that time wisely. The meeting continued well into the evening, with assignments distributed and preliminary protocols established. David would return to his campsite, now subtly reinforced with specialized observation equipment, and continue his documentation efforts. A rotating team of scientific observers would maintain a presence in the area, disguised as ordinary hikers or campers. All communications would be encrypted, and all personnel were sworn to absolute secrecy. As the meeting concluded, Dr. Chen pulled David aside. "There's something we haven't discussed yet," she said quietly, leading him to a corner of the room where they wouldn't be overheard. "The naming." David looked at her questioningly. "If these creatures are eventually confirmed as a new species, which seems increasingly likely, they'll need a scientific name. As the first person to document them conclusively, you would traditionally have naming rights." Her eyes were serious, but there was an undercurrent of excitement in her voice. "Have you given it any thought?" The question caught David by surprise. In the whirlwind of the day's events, the formality of scientific classification had been the furthest thing from his mind. No, I haven't. It seems presumptuous somehow. They've existed all this time without our labels." Dr. Chen nodded understandingly. "There's time, but it's something to consider. A name has power. It shapes how the world will think about these beings for generations to come." With that sobering thought, David was escorted back to his campsite, now subtly but significantly transformed. Unobtrusive camera traps had been positioned at strategic points around the perimeter. A small, weatherproof case containing sophisticated audio recording equipment had been disguised as an ordinary rock among others near his tent. His own cameras had been augmented with specialized lenses and infrared capabilities lent by the Yao research team. As night fell once again over Yellowstone, David sat by his campfire, reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed in just 24 hours. He had set out to photograph wolves and bears, perhaps add a few striking images to his portfolio. Instead, he had stumbled upon what might be the most significant zoological discovery of the century. The weight of responsibility was enormous. What happened next would depend partly on the creatures themselves, whether they returned to the area, how they behaved if they did, but also on how humans managed this new knowledge. History was not encouraging in this regard. Humanity's track record with newly discovered species was often a grim tale of exploitation, habitat destruction, and eventually, desperate conservation efforts that came too late. David was determined that this story would be different. As he prepared for sleep, He made a silent promise to the Sasquatch family. He would do everything in his power to ensure that their reveal to the world would not become their undoing. In the darkness beyond the campfire's glow, something moved. A shadow among shadows. David froze, straining his eyes against the night. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the silhouette of a large, upright figure at the forest's edge, watching. Then it was gone, leaving him to wonder if it had been there at all, or if his mind was playing tricks in the complex interplay of moonlight and branches. Either way, the message was clear. The watchers were now being watched. The secret was out, contained for the moment within a small circle of scientists and officials, but hovering on the edge of revelation. The clock was ticking, and the world, for better or worse, was about to change. The following morning, David awoke to the sounds of subtle activity around his campsite. Dr. Patel and Dr. Blackburn, dressed as ordinary hikers, were checking the camera traps and collecting samples from the area where the Sasquatch family had been observed. They worked methodically, careful not to disturb the environment more than necessary, preserving the natural state of the forest that had become an impromptu research station. "Any sign of them?" David asked, emerging from his tent. Dr. Blackburn shook his head. "Nothing yet on the cameras, but we did find some interesting hair samples caught on a pine tree at just the right height. And there are some disturbances in the soil that might be footprints, though they're not clear enough for casting." The day unfolded with a strange mix of tension and scientific precision. The small team maintained their cover as casual park visitors, while meticulously documenting everything about the environment: the plant species the Sasquatch had been observed foraging among, the water sources they might use, the types of shelter the forest provided. Around noon, Ranger Blackwood arrived with news. "We've started receiving the preliminary analysis from the hair samples collected yesterday," she reported quietly as they gathered in David's tent, away from the eyes and ears of any passing hikers. "The DNA sequencing is still in progress, but the morphology is fascinating. Definitely primate, thicker than human hair with a unique medulla pattern. It most closely resembles orangutan hair in structure, but with adaptations suggesting cold climate evolution." "Orangutan," David echoed. Surprised. "That's an Asian great ape. How would that connect to a North American species?" Dr. Blackburn looked thoughtful. "The Bering Land Bridge permitted migration between Asia and North America for thousands of years. It's not entirely implausible that an ancestral population of Asian great apes could have crossed and then adapted to the new environment, eventually evolving into what we're observing now." "But wouldn't we have found fossil evidence?" Dr. Patel questioned. "Not necessarily," Dr. Blackburn replied. "The fossil record is notoriously incomplete, especially for forest-dwelling species. Forests don't preserve remains well. Acidic soil, scavengers, rapid decomposition. And if the population was always small and adapted for mountain and forest environments, the chances of finding remains would be minimal." Their scientific discussion was interrupted by a sharp intake of breath from Ranger Blackwood, who had been monitoring one of the tablet screens connected to the camera traps. "Movement," she whispered, turning the screen so they all could see. "Northeast perimeter, camera 4. The image on the screen, captured in high-definition clarity, showed the unmistakable form of the adult male Sasquatch moving deliberately through the forest, about 200 yards from their position. Unlike the previous day, he was alone, moving with what appeared to be a scouting caution, pausing frequently to scan the environment and listen. "He's checking the territory," Dr. Blackburn murmured. Intelligent precaution before bringing the family back into the area. David watched, mesmerized by the creature's methodical movements. "Should we follow? Try to observe directly?" Ranger Blackwood shook her head firmly. "Absolutely not. We maintain position and let the technology do the observation. The last thing we want is to make him feel cornered or threatened." For the next hour, they tracked the Sasquatch's movements through the network of camera traps. He maintained a perimeter of roughly half a mile around the clearing, where the family had been spotted the previous day, occasionally stopping to examine something on the ground or in the trees, but never approaching the campsite directly. He knows we're here, David said softly. He's aware of the changes, the cameras, our presence. He's evaluating whether it's still safe for his family. Dr. Patel nodded. Remarkable risk assessment behavior. This isn't just animal caution. This is complex threat evaluation. As they watched, the Sasquatch completed his circuit and then, with one last long look in the direction of the campsite, disappeared into a dense section of forest where their camera coverage was thinner. We've lost visual, Ranger Blackwood reported, checking the feeds from the other cameras. No sign on any of the perimeter traps. A mixture of disappointment and respect washed over the group. The brief observation had been tantalizing, but insufficient for the comprehensive documentation they hoped to achieve. Yet there was something appropriate about the creature's caution, his ability to navigate their technological surveillance with such apparent awareness. We need to adjust our approach, Dr. Blackburn said finally. If he's aware of the cameras, and it certainly seems he is, we need to be more subtle. Less technology, more traditional field observation techniques. These creatures have evaded definitive documentation for generations. We won't outsmart them with a few camera traps. As the day waned into afternoon, a new plan was formed. The camera network would be maintained but scaled back to focus on likely travel corridors rather than blanket coverage. Instead, the team would establish observation blinds at strategic points, allowing for direct human observation with minimal disturbance. We need to earn their trust, David suggested, drawing on his years of wildlife photography experience, or at least convince them we're not a threat. That means predictable patterns, non-threatening behavior, and patience. Lots of patience. As the team worked to implement the revised strategy, word came from Chief Reynolds that the initial DNA analysis had yielded preliminary results. The genetic material, while degraded, was definitively primate and showed markers that were both human-like and distinct from any known great ape species. More comprehensive analysis would take time, but the initial findings were enough to convince even the most skeptical members of the small scientific team that they were indeed dealing with an undiscovered hominid species. The revelation brought both excitement and a renewed sense of purpose. What had begun as an extraordinary but uncertain sighting was rapidly evolving into a scientific discovery of historic proportions. With each passing hour, the reality of the Sasquatch family's existence became more firmly established in scientific fact, moving out of the realm of folklore and into the domain of zoological discovery. As the sun began to set on their second day of observation, casting long shadows through the trees, the team gathered once more to review their findings and refine their strategy for the days ahead. The Sasquatch hadn't returned with his family, but his solitary reconnaissance suggested they remained in the area, cautious but present, their secret existence now balanced on the knife edge of discovery. In the gathering darkness, the wild heart of Yellowstone kept its ancient rhythms. Somewhere in the vast forest that surrounded them, a family of creatures that science had yet to name continued their age-old patterns of survival, unaware that their long isolation was drawing to a close, their place in the natural world about to be redefined by human knowledge. For better or worse, the boundary between myth and science had been irreversibly crossed, and there would be no going back. 3 days had passed since David's initial sighting, and despite their refined observation techniques, the Sasquatch family remained elusive. The male had made 2 more solitary appearances at dawn and dusk, always maintaining a careful distance, but the female and juveniles hadn't returned to the area. The research team's excitement had begun to mingle with concern that they might have permanently disrupted the family's patterns, driving them deeper into the wilderness beyond their observation range. On the morning of the 4th day, David awoke, before sunrise, and slipped quietly from his tent. The camp was still, with only the soft electronic hum of monitoring equipment disturbing the pre-dawn silence. Dr. Blackburn was scheduled for the morning observation shift, but wouldn't arrive. For another hour, these solitary moments had become precious to David, a time to reflect on the extraordinary situation and reconnect with the natural environment that had drawn him to Yellowstone in the first place. Cup of steaming coffee in hand, David made his way to a small rocky outcrop about 50 yards from the main campsite. It offered a commanding view of the forest edge where the Sasquatch family had first been spotted. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the clouds with delicate shades of pink and gold. In that gentle light, the forest seemed magical, primordial, a fitting home for creatures that had evaded scientific discovery for so long. David settled onto a flat rock, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Over the past days, he had made a practice of coming to this spot each morning, establishing a pattern that he hoped might, in some small way, communicate predictability and non-aggression to the watching eyes he felt certain were monitoring the camp. He was midway through his coffee when he heard it, a soft rustling from the underbrush about 30 yards to his left. David turned his head slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. There, partially obscured by a stand of young aspens, stood the female Sasquatch. Unlike the previous sighting, she was alone, without the juveniles. She stood motionless, her eyes fixed on David with an intensity that was both intelligent and evaluative. In the soft morning light, David could see details that hadn't been apparent in his first encounter. Her hair was indeed a reddish-brown, lighter than the male's, with silver streaks around her face that suggested age or maturity. Her features, while undeniably primate, had a distinctly expressive quality. The eyes deep-set and thoughtful, the brow furrowed slightly as if in concentration. For what seemed an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, they regarded each other across the clearing, human and not human, observer and observed, each assessing the other with cautious curiosity. Then, with deliberate slowness, the female Sasquatch reached up to a nearby branch and plucked something. A pine cone, David realized, and placed it carefully on a fallen log that lay between them. The gesture was unmistakable in its intentionality. Whether it was meant as a gift, a marker, or some form of communication, David couldn't be sure. But its deliberateness struck him profoundly. This was no random animal behavior. This was purposeful interaction. Instinctively, David responded. Moving with the same slow deliberation, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small apple he had planned to eat with his breakfast. He placed it on the rocky ground beside him, then slowly retreated a few steps, giving the offering space. The female watched this exchange with evident interest, her head tilted slightly in what seemed remarkably like consideration. For a moment, David thought she might approach to examine the apple, but instead, she made a soft whooping sound, not unlike what he had heard on that first morning, and then melted back into the forest with surprising grace for her size. Heart racing, David remained motionless, processing what had just occurred. The encounter had lasted mere minutes, but its significance was enormous. This hadn't been a random sighting or a creature passing through. This had been intentional. Contact, communication, primitive perhaps, but unmistakable. When Dr. Blackburn arrived an hour later, David's excitement was palpable. He recounted the interaction in precise detail, careful not to embellish or interpret beyond what he had actually observed. The primatologist listened with rapt attention, his expression shifting from excitement to awe. "This changes everything," he said when David had finished. "This wasn't just a sighting. This was interaction. Deliberate, considered interaction. The pinecone placement especially suggests symbolic thinking, a hallmark of advanced cognition." By mid-morning, the entire research team had gathered at David's campsite, the news of the interaction galvanizing them with renewed purpose. The pinecone remained untouched on the log where it had been placed, now surrounded by small markers placed by the scientists to preserve its exact position for documentation. "We need to expand our understanding of their communication methods," Dr. Chen suggested, her notepad already filled with observations and questions. "The whooping sounds, the physical placing of objects, these are sophisticated forms of nonverbal communication. And the timing is significant," Ranger Blackwood added. "She came when David was alone, at a time and place where he had established a consistent, non-threatening pattern. That suggests not just intelligence but strategic thinking and risk assessment." As the team debated the implications, Special Agent Torres arrived with news from the outside world. "We've got a problem," she announced, her expression grim. "There's been a leak. I don't know how, but word is starting to spread. My office received inquiries this morning from 2 different wildlife journalist contacts asking about unusual primate research in Yellowstone." A tense silence fell over the group. They had known this moment would come eventually, but had hoped for more time. Time to establish protocols, time to gather more data, time to prepare for the media storm that would inevitably follow such a monumental discovery. "How bad is it?" Chief Reynolds asked, his weathered face tight with concern. "Still contained for now," Torres replied. "Just whispers and speculation. Nothing about Sasquatch specifically, just rumors about a significant primate discovery. But it won't stay vague for long. Once people start connecting the dots..." "We need to get ahead of this," Dr. Chen stated firmly. "A controlled release of information on our terms, rather than letting rumors and speculation run wild." The discussion that followed was intense, with strong opinions on all sides. Some argued for continued secrecy, citing the need for more research before going public. Others, including David, suggested that a limited release of information might actually help protect the Sasquatch by allowing for official conservation measures. "If we acknowledge their existence on our terms," David argued, "we can control the narrative, emphasize their intelligence, their familial bonds, the need for protection and respect. If we wait until the story breaks elsewhere, we lose that control." In the end, a compromise was reached. A preliminary scientific paper would be prepared, documenting the initial sighting and subsequent observations. Carefully selected images from David's footage would accompany it, enough to establish the credibility of the discovery, but not so much as to turn the Sasquatch family into internet sensations. The paper would emphasize the preliminary nature of the findings and the critical importance of protecting these newly discovered primates and their habitat. As the team dispersed to begin work on their respective parts of the announcement, David returned to his rocky observation point. The sun was high now, the morning's magic light replaced by the starker illumination of midday. The forest seemed different somehow, less mysterious, more vulnerable. Soon, this quiet corner of Yellowstone would be forever changed, its secret revealed to a world that was not always kind to its mysteries. David's contemplation was interrupted by Dr. Patel, who approached with a satellite phone in hand. "Call for you," she said, her expression unreadable. "Director Matthews from the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. Apparently, he's heard rumors and went straight to the top. The park superintendent, who referred him to us." Taking the phone, David found himself speaking with one of the most respected figures in natural history research. The director was cautious, but direct, asking pointed questions about the sighting, the evidence, and the current status of the research. "Mr. Mercer," the director said after David had provided a careful summary, "if what you're describing is accurate, and your reputation suggests it is, we're facing what may be the most significant zoological discovery of the century. The Smithsonian stands ready to provide whatever resources and expertise might be needed to document and, crucially, to protect these creatures." The conversation continued for nearly half an hour, covering everything from DNA analysis to habitat protection strategies. By its conclusion, the small research operation at Yellowstone had gained a powerful ally. an institution with both the scientific credibility and the political influence to ensure that the Sasquatch discovery would be treated with the seriousness it deserved. As David handed the phone back to Dr. Patel, a commotion from the main campsite caught their attention. Voices were raised in excitement, and they could see several team members pointing toward the forest edge on the far side of the clearing. Hurrying back, David was met by an astonished Dr. Blackburn. "They're back," he whispered, guiding David to a position where he could see without being obvious. "All of them. And they're watching us." At the forest edge, partially concealed among the trees but clearly visible to the trained observers, stood the Sasquatch family. The male was in front, his massive frame serving as a protective barrier for the others. Behind him, the female and the two juveniles were clustered together, their expressions a mixture of caution and what David could only interpret as curiosity. "They've been there for at least 10 minutes, Dr. Blackburn continued, "just watching. No attempt to approach or retreat. It's as if they're studying us as intently as we've been studying them." David reached slowly for his camera, but Dr. Blackburn placed a restraining hand on his arm. "No sudden movements. We don't want to spook them. Besides, the remote cameras are capturing everything." For over an hour, this strange standoff continued. Humans and Sasquatch observing each other across the divide of the clearing, neither making any move to close the distance. It was the most prolonged observation period they had achieved, and the researchers worked in near silence, documenting every detail of the family's appearance and behavior. The breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Chen's assistant, a graduate student named Maya who had arrived the previous day, had been sitting quietly at the edge of the camp, sketching the Sasquatch family in a large pad. Her artistic ability was remarkable, and she had captured the creatures with a sensitivity and detail that photography might have missed. One of the juveniles, the more adventurous one that David had noted in his first sighting, seemed particularly fascinated by Maya's activity. It kept edging forward, only to be gently restrained by the female. After several such attempts, the juvenile gave what sounded remarkably like a sound of frustration and sat down on the forest floor, still staring intently at Maya. "I think it's curious about the drawing," Maya whispered to Dr. Chen. "It keeps trying to get a better look." On an impulse, Maya carefully tore the completed sketch from her pad, stood slowly, and placed it on the ground about 10 yards from her position, halfway between the humans and the Sasquatch family. Then she retreated to her original spot and resumed sketching. The effect on the Sasquatch family was immediate and dramatic. The male made a series of low vocalizations, seeming to confer with the female. The juvenile that had shown interest in the drawing bounced with what looked remarkably like excitement, though it remained by its mother's side. After what appeared to be a family conference, the male Sasquatch made a decision. With a cautious deliberation that spoke volumes about his intelligence and risk assessment, he moved forward into the clearing. Walking with the smooth bipedal gait that had so amazed David in his first sighting, the Sasquatch approached the sketch Maya had left. The entire research team held their breath, frozen in place, as the massive creature bent to examine the drawing. He studied it for several long moments, his expression unreadable to human observers but intensely focused. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he picked it up with surprising delicacy, considering the size and power of his hands. The Sasquatch turned the paper this way and that, examining both sides in a display of curiosity that was unmistakably intelligent. Finally, still holding the sketch, he looked directly at the group of humans, his gaze moving from one face to another before settling on Maya. The moment stretched, electric with significance. Then, with deliberate care, the Sasquatch placed the sketch back on the ground and retreated a few steps. He made a series of gestures toward the female and juveniles that seemed to communicate reassurance, though they remained at the forest edge. "He's inviting further interaction," Dr. Blackburn whispered, his voice tight with controlled excitement. But on his terms, with him as the intermediary. This is extraordinary. This is negotiated contact. Over the next several hours, a remarkable exchange unfolded. Maya created more drawings of the forest, of animals, and eventually, with careful consideration, simplified representations of humans and Sasquatch together. Each drawing was placed in the neutral ground between the two groups, and each was carefully examined by the male Sasquatch, who seemed to grow more comfortable with the process as it continued. By late afternoon, a tentative pattern of communication had been established. The male would examine each drawing, sometimes making vocalizations that seemed to be directed back toward his family. Occasionally, he would make gestures that the researchers began to recognize as expressions of interest or requests for more. We're witnessing the establishment of interspecies communication protocols, Dr. Blackburn commented, his academic vocabulary barely containing his wonder. They're intelligent enough to recognize representational art and to understand its communicative purpose. That's a cognitive leap that puts them squarely in the realm of higher primates. As the light began to fade, the Sasquatch family retreated into the forest, the male being the last to leave, with what seemed like a final lingering look at the humans who had entered their world. The research team was left in a state of exhilarated exhaustion, the day's events having exceeded their wildest expectations. That evening, as they gathered around the campfire to discuss next steps, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. What had begun as a scientific documentation project had evolved into something more profound. The beginning of a relationship with an intelligent, family-oriented species that had managed to exist alongside human civilization while remaining undiscovered. "We need to rethink our entire approach," Dr. Chen said, staring thoughtfully into the flames. "This isn't just about documentation anymore. We're establishing first contact with an intelligent social species. Every interaction, every decision we make, sets a precedent for the relationship between humans and Sasquatch going forward." David, who had been quietly reviewing his notes from the day, looked up. "That's exactly why we need to be thoughtful about how we present this to the world. These aren't just biological specimens. They're beings with agency, with family structures, with what appears to be culture and communication. Our announcement needs to reflect that reality." The conversation continued late into the night, the scientific and ethical implications of the day's events weaving together into a complex tapestry of responsibility. By the time they retired to their tents, a new consensus had emerged. Their role was not just to study the Sasquatch, but to serve as their advocates in the human world that was about to discover their existence. Dawn brought a flurry of activity. Chief Reynolds arrived with news that the park superintendent had authorized the creation of a special task force, granted emergency funding, and initiated the process for establishing a protected research zone around the sighting area. The Smithsonian had dispatched a team of specialists who would arrive by helicopter that afternoon, bringing sophisticated equipment for non-invasive observation and analysis. Through it all, David found himself increasingly drawn to his role, not just as a documentarian, but as a bridge between species. His photography, which had always sought to capture the essence and dignity of wildlife, took on new significance as he considered how these images would shape humanity's first impression of the Sasquatch. By mid-morning, the draft announcement had been completed and transmitted to Washington for review. It was concise but comprehensive, acknowledging the extraordinary nature of the discovery while emphasizing the preliminary state of the research and the paramount importance of protection. David's most striking image, the male Sasquatch examining, Maya's drawing, his expression a perfect study and intelligent curiosity, had been selected as the lead visual. As David reviewed the final version of the announcement, a commotion at the forest edge drew his attention. The Sasquatch family had returned earlier than expected, but something was different this time. The male, instead of approaching alone, had brought the entire family into the clearing. They stood together, about 30 yards from the campsite, making no attempt to hide or retreat. The researchers gathered, maintaining a respectful distance, as the Sasquatch family seemed to conduct some kind of internal discussion. The male and female made a series of vocalizations and gestures, while the juveniles watched attentively. Then, to everyone's amazement, the entire family began to move forward, slowly and with evident caution, but deliberately closing the distance between the two species. They stopped about 15 yards away, close enough for detailed observation, but still maintaining a buffer zone that spoke of prudent caution. The male made a rumbling sound, then gestured toward Maya, who had been sketching the scene. "I think he wants another drawing," she whispered. "But what should I draw?" "Something meaningful," David suggested. "Something that shows we understand the significance of this moment." Maya thought for a moment, then began to sketch rapidly. When she finished, she held up the drawing for all to see. A simple but powerful image of a human hand and a Sasquatch hand reaching toward each other, not quite touching, reminiscent of Michelangelo's creation of Adam. The effect on the Sasquatch family was profound. The male made a sound unlike any they had heard before, a deep, resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the clearing. The female joined in, and then, in high, clear tones, the juveniles added their voices. The sound they created together was haunting and beautiful, a family chorus that sent shivers down the spines of the human observers. When the vocalization ended, the male Sasquatch did something that none of the researchers had anticipated. He reached down and picked up a small stone from the ground. With deliberate care, he placed it at the halfway point between the two groups, then backed away, rejoining his family. The message seemed clear: a marker, a boundary stone, a symbol of the division between their worlds, but also of the meeting point they had established. It was a gesture that acknowledged both separation and connection, delivered with an intelligence that could no longer be denied. As the Sasquatch family retreated once more to the forest edge, there was a sense of ceremony to their departure, as if some important transaction had been completed. The researchers remained silent, aware that they had witnessed something profound, not just a scientific discovery, but the beginning of a relationship between two intelligent species who had shared a planet for millennia without acknowledging each other's existence. The announcement went public that evening, carefully coordinated across multiple scientific and governmental platforms. David's footage and Maya's drawings, accompanied by the preliminary findings of the research team, were released to a world that was about to have its understanding of primate evolution and human uniqueness fundamentally challenged. The immediate reaction was a predictable mix of sensation, skepticism, and wonder. News organizations around the globe led with the story. Social media erupted in debate and speculation. The scientific community, initially divided, began to coalesce around the evidence, which was too comprehensive and too credibly sourced to dismiss. At Yellowstone, a new chapter had begun. The area around the sighting had been designated as the North American Primate Research and Conservation Zone, with strict limitations on access and a comprehensive protection protocol. David had accepted a position as the official documentation coordinator, working alongside the expanding team of researchers who had been carefully vetted not just for their scientific credentials, but for their ethical approach to interspecies contact. The Sasquatch family, far from being driven away by the increased human presence, seemed to have made a collective decision to engage with the research team, on their terms and at their own pace. The interactions remained limited and occurred at unpredictable intervals, but each contact added to the growing understanding of these remarkable beings. DNA analysis had confirmed what observation had suggested. The Sasquatch represented a previously unknown hominid species, with genetic markers that placed them somewhere between great apes and humans on the evolutionary tree. They appeared to be a relict population, the survivors of an ancient lineage that had managed to adapt and persist in the wilderness areas of North America, while their relatives elsewhere had vanished into extinction. 6 months after the initial sighting, David stood once more at his favorite observation point, camera in hand, watching the Sasquatch family in the early morning light. They had become more comfortable with his presence, sometimes allowing him to observe from as close as 20 yards, a proximity that spoke of growing trust. The juveniles were playing, engaged in what appeared to be a game of chase and wrestling that wasn't so different from what human children might enjoy. The female was nearby, watchful but relaxed, occasionally making soft vocalizing sounds that seemed to guide or correct the youngster's behavior. The male was foraging, methodically examining plants and occasionally harvesting something to eat or to bring back to the family. It was a domestic scene, familiar in its family dynamics, yet extraordinary in its participants. As David captured images of this intimate glimpse into Sasquatch life, he reflected on how dramatically the world had changed in half a year. The discovery had rippled through human society, challenging assumptions, inspiring new research, and forcing a reconsideration of humanity's place in the natural order. There had been challenges, of course. The initial announcement had brought a flood of would-be Sasquatch hunters and thrill-seekers to Yellowstone, requiring enhanced security, measures and strict enforcement of the new protection zones. There had been debates in scientific and philosophical circles about the ethical implications of the discovery, particularly regarding the question of personhood and legal status for a species that showed clear signs of intelligence and social complexity. But there had also been a remarkable shift in consciousness, a growing public fascination not just with the fact of the Sasquatch's existence, but with their nature, their family bonds, their communication methods, their evident intelligence. The most compelling footage and images weren't those that simply proved their existence, but those that revealed their essence. The careful way the adults protected the young, the curiosity they showed toward human activities, the complex vocalizations they used to communicate with each other. As David watched the family going about their morning routine, a soft whooping call drew his attention. The male had spotted him and was making the now familiar greeting sound, not an alarm, but an acknowledgement. David raised his hand in a slow, gentle wave, a human gesture that the Sasquatch had come to recognize. The male Sasquatch returned, the gesture, his massive hand moving in a deliberate imitation of the human wave. It was a small thing, this exchange of greetings across the species barrier, but it symbolized something profound, the beginning of understanding between two intelligent beings whose paths had finally, officially crossed. In that moment, watching the golden morning light illuminate the clearing where history had been made, David knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, something precious had been accomplished. The Sasquatch family continued to live in freedom, their autonomy respected even as their existence was acknowledged. The research continued with care and ethics as its guiding principles. And across the divide of evolution and time, two species had begun the long, complex process of getting to know each other. The mystery hadn't ended with discovery. In many ways, it had only deepened. But it was a mystery now pursued in the open, with wonder rather than skepticism as its driving force. The Sasquatch had stepped out of legend and into scientific reality, bringing with them new questions about consciousness, communication, and coexistence that would engage humanity for generations to come. As the family moved deeper into the forest, disappearing once more into the landscape that had sheltered them for millennia, David lowered his camera. The footage was captured, the documentation secured. But beyond the scientific value, beyond the career-defining discovery, there was something more important: the privilege of witnessing a new chapter in the relationship between humans and the natural world, a chapter defined not by dominance but by recognition and respect. The Sasquatch family of Yellowstone had changed everything, not by doing anything extraordinary, but simply by being who they were: intelligent, social beings, with their own world, their own bonds, their own way of being. In acknowledging their existence, humanity had been given a rare second chance to approach another intelligent species with wisdom and care, to write a new story of discovery that honored both the observed and the observers. As David packed his equipment and prepared for another day of patient documentation, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The greatest wildlife discovery of the century had fallen to him not by design, but by chance. But what happened next would be a matter of choice. And as the summer sun rose higher over Yellowstone, illuminating a world forever changed by what had been revealed in its shadows, he committed himself anew to ensuring that those choices would be worthy of the remarkable beings who had allowed humans, at long last, to recognize them.